we go. All right. Yeah, so I forgot to record. So anyway, just to go back to what I was just saying, today we're going to cover the endocrine, first one. Tomorrow we're going to cover the second endocrine. I'm also going to be assigning an extra credit. I'm not sure if it's going to be 10 or 5 points. I'll let you know. That will take us into next week, our last week, where we'll be covering digestion. And we'll be getting back into more of the comparative physiology, talking about the digestive tract of birds, the digestive tract of ruminants, such as cattle, sheep, and goats, who have 4 chambers to their stomachs, and then what we call the monogastric. So we're not going to be, we're going to be really focusing on birds and different types of mammals that have different types of digestive systems based upon their diet, and which helps them obviously digest things differently. For example, digesting straw or hay, ruminants can do that, but we can't. And the reasons for that have to do with their digestive tract and some of the different chemicals found there. All right. So let's go ahead and begin with the endocrine system. All right, so when we talk about endocrinology, I'm going to cover some comparative aspects of it, but primarily it's going to be mammalian. What is endocrinology? Endocrinology is the study of hormones and the glands that produce them in health, in other words, normally, and also what happens during pathological conditions or disease. And there's a lot of different diseases that are associated with malfunctions of the endocrine system. You may have heard of them, things like diabetes, things like hypothyroidism, hyperthyroidism, acromegaly, some of these different terms. We're going to go over some of the diseases that result from either not producing enough of the hormones or producing too much. All right, so endocrine glands are the names of the organs that make hormones. And hormones are a type of chemical messenger. We've already learned somewhat about chemical messengers earlier. We learned about neurotransmitters, right? Those are chemical messengers that are found in the nervous system, where at the synaptic terminal, neurotransmitter is released, goes across a cleft, binds to a receptor on another nerve cell or on another tissue, whether it's muscle, whether it's the heart, whether it's the digestive tract, okay? In the case of hormones, we're looking at chemicals that are made by special types of cells called endocrine glands. And one of the key differences is that instead of these hormones or chemicals having an effect nearby or locally, they're transported through the blood. And once they enter into the blood, of course, the blood is like the blood vessels are like a freeway, carries to all different parts of the body. So these hormones are conveyed throughout the entire body where they have certain effects. Now, depending upon whether they're going to have an effect or not determines whether there's a receptor or not. And receptor, much like we spoke about acetylcholine receptors, adrenergic receptors, this is a protein that in this case, the hormone binds to, kind of like a lock and key fit. If the receptor is there, you'll have an effect. If there is no receptor, you won't have an effect. The fact that these hormones are produced and are secreted into the blood, hold on one second, that are secreted into the blood, they're able to really be present in low levels and exert effects at really small quantities. For example, picograms or nanograms. That would be a trillionth of a gram or a billionth of a gram. It's very low levels, and this can be detected in the blood. So it doesn't take much of a hormone to cause an effect. If we were to take the different types of hormones, we're going to cover quite a few of them. Initially, we can divide them up into whether they're produced by typical endocrine glands, like I mentioned up here, or they're produced by neurons. And I'm going to briefly mention there's a couple examples where chemicals from neurons, instead of being released to another neuron or another tissue, go right into the blood. And those are what we call neurohormones. I'm going to give you an effect of what we call neurohormones, of which there are a few, and classical hormones, which was going to be 95% of everything, whether it's the adrenal hormones, thyroid hormones, pituitary hormones, pancreatic hormones. All right. So we've spoken about the nervous system previously, but now just for a comparative aspect, we take a look at the nervous system and the endocrine system. Both of them are systems that involve communication. So why do we have both? It seems to be somewhat redundant. Well, there is a little bit of redundancy, but you'll see why we need both. There are some differences. First of all, the nervous system communicates with other cells via electrical activity. We spoke about action potentials and gap junctions, as well as with neurotransmitters, the chemical. With the endocrine system, the hormone is released into the blood, right, and have an effect on a distant site. You can cross off where this says neurohormones, because that is kind of muddies the water a little bit. There's been kind of a back and forth. Are neurohormones hormones or neurotransmitters? Let's just cross that off and refer to neurotransmitters as part of the nervous system and hormones as part of the endocrine system. The neurotransmitters are released close to the cells where they're going to have an effect. In contrast, endocrine glands secrete a hormone from a site far removed where they're going to have an effect. For example, there are hormones that are released from the brain, from the pituitary gland, that have an effect on the reproductive organs, or the adrenal gland, or the thyroid gland. So that's another difference. Another difference has to do with the speed in which these hormones exert their effect. With the nervous system, because it's electrical, followed by chemical to that across that very short synaptic cleft, the effects are very fast. We know the autonomic nervous system, the fight or flight, right? Heart races very quickly after the stress. In contrast, the endocrine system is slower. Now, when it says slow, I don't mean hours to days. I mean, maybe if the nervous system acts in milliseconds, the endocrine system might act in seconds or minutes. So it's a little bit slower. The duration of the effects are different too. The nervous system neurotransmitters their effect is very short-lived because, remember, they're broken down by enzymes such as acetylcholinesterase or COMT or MAO, right? Whereas the endocrine system typically has much longer effects, more sustaining. So really, we need both of these systems because there are sometimes we need very rapid response, sometimes we need more of a delayed long-term response, and sometimes we need both. All right, so let's do a little comparison of what I just mentioned, comparing neurotransmitters to hormones. Here is a neuron releasing a neurotransmitter across the cleft to a postsynaptic cell binding to receptors. Here is an endocrine cell, which is typically an epithelial cell in a gland, secretes its substance into the blood through fenestrated capillaries. Once in the blood, it passes through the circulation and reaches what we call the target organs. Target organs refer to those tissues, those glands that have receptors for that specific chemical. For example, here, if we take a look, this just for visual purposes, you take a look at these receptors, notice this kind of a rounded groove. Well, this hormone fits really well right into that. So this would be a receptor for this hormone. This cell has receptors, but not for this hormone. So this would not be a target for this hormone. It would be a target for some other hormone. All right. Now, a couple other examples of chemical messengers, what we call neurosecretory cells. And that's where I was talking to you about what we call neurohormones. Go back right here. Neurohormones. Neurohormones are hormones that are released instead of by endocrine glands, by neurons. And those neurons release a chemical instead of to another cell, release it right into the blood. So it's basically, once it's in the blood, it's just like a hormone. The only difference is the cell that's producing it happens to be a nerve cell. Best example of this is in the hypothalamus, which we'll take a look at shortly. Other examples of chemical messengers, which I'm just mentioning in name only, we're not really going to discuss them. These are what we call paracrine, I should say paracrine and autocrine effects. This is where a cell produces a chemical that doesn't go into the blood, right? It's not a neuron, but what it does, it has an effect on neighboring cells, like right next to it, or effects on itself. This is what we call autocrine and paracrine. And a variety of different growth factors work this way to trigger tissue growth. Basically a local effect as opposed to more of a distant effect. All right. So why are hormones important? And that's a loaded question, right? So hormones are really a messenger. And this messenger sends information, communicates the status of a particular area of the body to other areas to try to coordinate what's going on, right? So if you've got high blood pressure, right, hormones are going to be produced that are going to travel through the body, so every cell in the body is going to know you've got high blood pressure, and then you have to respond. It's a way of coordinating. Now, there's a lot of different hormones, and I can guarantee there's probably going to be some that, even though we've discovered a lot, there's going to be some that we still don't know about, possibly, maybe with technology or other things, we'll find out more, or different effects. If we're to take all the different hormones that are produced and kind of categorize them, it's like, what is their role? We can essentially divide them up into 4 categories. Those hormones that are involved in growth and development, we'll talk about those. Good example would be thyroid hormone and actually growth hormone. We'll talk about hormones that are involved in regulating metabolism. We'll talk about hormones that are regulating the internal environment. Remember talking about homeostasis, right? So this would be hormones that are regulating the osmolarity. Remember things like aldosterone, ANF, or ANP, as well as hormones that regulate blood sugar and calcium. And finally, hormones that regulate reproduction. I'm going to mention them in name only just because the time frame of this course doesn't allow us really to cover too much in the reproductive system, but at least I want you guys to be aware, which I'm sure you are already, of the hormones that are involved. All right. So as you can see from this picture, it's pointing to a lot of different organs, we call primary and secondary endocrine glands. And you might look at these and you think, wait a minute, the heart, that's not an endocrine gland, that's a pump. And wait a minute, there's the small intestine, that's involved in digestion. And then there's the kidney. Well, that's true. Some of these organs have other functions. But in addition to their other function, whether it's filtering blood or pumping blood or whatever, they also produce hormones. So everything you see right here is we have what we call primary endocrine organs, which are the ones on the left. And these are the ones that producing hormones is their main function. On the right, where it says secondary organs, these are organs that have really other functions that predominate, but secondarily they produce hormones. We're not going to cover every single gland, but we're going to cover Some primarily the primary ones, actually. All right. So we've got a lot of different organs. We're going to talk about a lot of different hormones they make. And of course, you guys have taken biochemistry or classes where you've discussed biochemistry. And if you think of these chemical messengers, what are they? What is the biological molecule? We can take all the different hormones and divide them up into 4 distinct categories. They're either what we call amines, and we'll learn about these. These are hormones that are modified amino acids. We're going to talk about some hormones that are peptides, kind of short proteins, short chains of amino acids. We'll talk about larger chains of amino acids or proteins. And then finally, we'll get into steroids. All right. So here's a list of the primary endocrine organs that was on that previous page. And we're going to cover most of these between today and tomorrow. All right. So this table, it kind of it looks a little bit daunting, so I don't want you to get all like overwhelmed or stressing out about it. But I put it up there because it shows several different categories that I think are important whenever we're discussing the endocrine system. Number one, what is the gland involved? What is the hormone that gland makes? Where does that hormone go? In other words, what is the target of that hormone? And what are the effects? Okay. There's one other category that's not listed here, and that is what triggers this gland to make the hormone. In other words, we're not always making a lot of glucagon, epinephrine, leptin, oxytocin. There are certain conditions that trigger these glands to make it, and we'll talk about that as well. All right. So I always like to discuss a little bit of history just to kind of show you what we have learned over the years. I'm not going to go back too far, even though 1849 sounds pretty far away, but there's a lot of other stuff that was done prior to that. I'm just going to focus, I think, on some really key things. The year was 1849. Arnold Berthold was a scientist who was the first person to describe a substance secreted from the testes that must enter the blood to affect behavior and is responsible for development of a cockerel into a rooster. Okay, a cockerel is an immature male chicken, hasn't reached puberty yet. Okay, so the key thing here is the fact that someone actually thought that a chemical is released into the blood. That was historic. Of course, they didn't know what that substance was. Of course, we now know that would be testosterone, affecting all different aspects of male behavior. Another historical time was 1901. A scientist named Takamine, who lived in Japan, is credited with having discovered the first hormone, epinephrine, which was produced by the adrenal medulla. Now you're thinking, wait a minute, I thought epinephrine was produced in the sympathetic nervous system. Well, the adrenal medulla, as we all know, is really part of the sympathetic nervous system, part of the fight or flight response. 1905, 2 scientists, Bayliss and Starling, and Starling is very well known for a variety of things. You may have heard of Starling's law of the heart. There's also Starling forces. I think that's the same Starling, I'm not sure. But definitely Starling's law of the heart. They were the first people to use the word hormone to describe these blood-borne molecules. And hormone in Greek means to arouse. And that might sound appropriate because there's a lot of hormones that stimulate metabolism, increase levels of calcium, do all sorts of things. But it's kind of a misnomer because some hormones also suppress things, right? Insulin lowers blood sugar. But anyway, that's when it was first used. This follows their 1902 discovery of secretin. And secretin is a hormone that's produced by the small intestine that stimulates the pancreas. So one thing that's interesting about this is, of course, over the years, there's been always a lot of scientific controversies, competition, challenges. The discovery of secretin was in 1902. Now, of course, obviously back then they didn't have, their methods of communication were different. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have a lot of ways to get information worldwide very quickly. So there was a lot of people that thought that Bayliss and Starling discovered secretin. That was the first hormone. But in reality, it was Takamine. So, all right. So here's a little diagram showing Berthold's experiment. And the drawing is not that detailed, but hopefully you can kind of get the context of it. This is meant to be a cockerel, which is an immature male chicken. And obviously, normally it grows into a rooster. But if you castrate it before it reaches maturity, it's going to grow up looking like this. It really looks like a hen, right? It's what's called capenization. Or a castrated male chicken is called a capen. This is what Berthold did. So then he thought, let's take those testes and reimplant them. Or basically take them out and reimplant them. And what happens? This is another chicken. Obviously, it grows and grows and becomes a normal-looking rooster. You've got the tail feathers, you've got the comb, you've got the wattle, you've got the spikes on the limbs, and it was strutting around like a normal rooster. Then he did this experiment, like an organ exchange, moving the testes from one animal to the other. So kind of a complete experiment. And the conclusion was, of course, that in order, this substance, which is produced by the testes, which in chickens are internal, the fact that it affects the comb and the wattle and the tails, how is it getting there? It must enter into some circulation that's delivering it to these spots. So pretty cool experiment. All right. So that's a little bit of history. There could be a lot more, but we're going to kind of ignore that for now. So many hormones exhibit the same functions in all animals. I just want to mention that across the board. A lot of pituitary hormones, thyroid hormones, things like that have effects very similar in a lot of animals. But there are some variations. For example, we're going to talk about thyroxine, which is a hormone produced by the thyroid gland. And one of the things we're going to learn that in us, it stimulates growth, stimulates metabolism. In amphibians, it's the hormone responsible for tadpoles becoming frogs, metamorphosis. If you do microsurgery and remove the thyroid gland from a tadpole, it'll just grow up to be a really, really large, scary-looking tadpole. Another hormone called prolactin is produced by the anterior pituitary. We'll see that shortly. With the name lact, right? Think of lactation. And of course, mammals lactate. So in mammals, one of the functions of prolactin, there are a few, but one of them is stimulating milk production. Now in other animals, for example, in birds, obviously birds do not lactate, but they still have maternal instincts. They actually have what's called a brood patch, which while they're incubating an egg, it's the part of the skin that's in contact with the egg that loses feathers, the skin thickens and really warms the egg. That's called the brood patch. And that develops due to prolactin. Also, it's called a crop sac. Crop sac is a structure along the neck that the mother uses to regurgitate and feed the young. You may have seen that in some nests. So those are all maternal functions. But then the fish is a whole other ball of wax. In the fish, if you remember from those chloride cells, prolactin plays a role in regulating ion movement. So go figure. In MSH, We'll talk about that a little bit later. This is produced by a part of the gland, pituitary gland, called the intermediate pituitary. In many animals, such as amphibians, reptiles, and some birds, it plays a role in pigmentation, color changes, darkening, things like that. Now in us, yes, you go out in the sun, and some people, some more than others, their skin will darken more. This has to do with the production of melanin, which is produced in the skin. We don't really produce much MSH as adults, but in other animals, it still has a predominant role in skin pigmentation. It stands for melanocyte stimulating hormone. Finally, another melatonin, and of course, I'm sure many of you guys have heard of this. It's even of big interest clinically. It's a hormone that's produced by us, by most animals at nighttime, right? It seems to be involved in inducing sleep, circadian rhythms. In animals, I should say most wild animals, it's involved in regulating seasonal reproduction. So that animals, regulating when animals breed. They will breed only certain times of the year when the offspring could be born at a time that's conducive for their survival. So this is why, for example, deer in the northern hemisphere will breed in the fall. They have a 6-month gestation, so their young are born in the spring. They don't breed after that. And a lot of this is dictated by melatonin. And we'll talk more about that later. That's actually what I did my master's thesis on. So pretty interesting, I thought. Okay. A few slides back, I spoke about how hormones can be classified based on their what type of biological molecule they are, right? So we're going to take a look at some examples of each. First type of biological molecule is the amines. And these are amines are amino acid derivatives. There's two types of amino acids I want to talk about. One is tyrosine, and the other is tryptophan. The hormones that are classified as amines are thyroid hormone, for example, T3 and T4. T3 and T4, or otherwise known as triiodothyronine and thyroxine, they're produced by the thyroid gland by the conversion of tyrosine into those hormones. Tyrosine also is responsible for the production of epinephrine. So both thyroid hormones and epinephrine are amines derived from tyrosine. There's another amino acid known as tryptophan, and tryptophan is converted into melatonin. So melatonin is also considered to be an amine. All right, so what do we know about amines? So I spoke about receptors, right? That hormones bind to receptors, much like neurotransmitters bind to receptors. Well, when we start talking about hormones, one of the things you're going to learn, we have hormones that are we call hydrophilic or lipophilic. Hydrophilic hormones are ones that cannot cross the cell membrane of their target organ. Because remember, if you've learned from other classes that the cell membrane is essentially a phospholipid bilayer. So a hormone that's hydrophilic, such as norepinephrine and epinephrine, can't cross the membrane. So they bind to receptors that are found on the cell membrane. I'm not going to go through all this stuff now. We just don't have time to. Some of the signaling stuff. But just know it's membrane receptors. The other amines, such as thyroid hormones and melatonin, have both hydrophilic and lipophilic properties and can bind to membrane receptors as well as nuclear receptors, in other words, inside the cell. So membrane receptors and intracellular receptors. This happens to be showing a steroid hormone. We'll learn more about how that's very similar to these because steroids cross into the cell. So what we're looking at is the different ways that hormones can affect a target cell based upon its nature. If it's hydrophilic, it binds to a membrane receptor to trigger a response. If it's lipophilic, it binds to a intracellular receptor. And in some cases, you have you basically have lipophilic and hydrophilic properties, and it can bind to both. All right. Okay. Moving on to peptides and proteins. Peptides are chains of less than 100 amino acids. A good example of that is ADH, which you guys remember that one, or vasopressin, and insulin. These are considered peptides. And then we have proteins. Good example would be growth hormone and prolactin. And these are chains of more than 100 amino acids. These are what we call proteins. Obviously, we can go through the entire chart, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to kind of give you some examples. Peptides and proteins and most amines are all basically have these same properties. They're hydrophilic. Of course, that would be, the exception would be like thyroid hormone and melatonin, which are also have some lipophilic properties. They all bind to a membrane receptor. They activate an intracellular message called the second messenger, which involves phosphorylating proteins and opening ion channels. The reason why I'm mentioning this, other than the fact that it's important to understand how a hormone affects a target cell, is to distinguish it from how steroid hormones work. The effects of amines, most amines, and proteins and peptides, because they bind to a membrane receptor, they act very fast, and the duration is very short, kind of like neurotransmitters. Moving on to steroids. So steroids are all derived, much like we just spoke about amines are derived from amino acids, steroids are derived from this parent molecule, cholesterol. And of course we hear bad stuff about cholesterol, right? LDL and all that, but we do produce cholesterol naturally through our liver, and we do need cholesterol for a variety of physiological effects. Amongst those are the production of hormones. This is a list of some of the steroids that we produce. And again, I'm not going to ask you to draw out these structures, but you can see right here we've got testosterone, estradiol, which is a type of estrogen. We have cortisol, we have aldosterone. What it doesn't show here is another steroid known as progesterone. So these are the five main classes of steroids that are produced in the body, all from cholesterol. Let's take a look at some of the differences. First of all, in contrast to the amines, peptides, and proteins that are produced in a wide variety of different tissues, steroid hormones are produced by only the gonads and the adrenal cortex, which we'll learn about later. And this has to do with embryonic development of mesoderm and a lot of that aspects, that this is the only place where you find steroid hormones. They're all cholesterol derived, meaning that they're lipids and they can actually enter into a target cell. So they bind to intracellular receptors. Those intracellular receptors can be in the cytoplasm or they can be in the nucleus, but they're inside the cell. In contrast to the membrane receptor actions, which are very quick, short duration, steroid hormones act slowly because for their effects, their mechanism of action is once they bind to these receptors, the receptors in turn activate transcription factors to trigger transcription and translation. This is a slower acting process and with a much longer duration. This is why, from a therapeutic standpoint, people who need to get cortisone shots, either for joint pain or for back pain or for other things, doctors have to be very careful how often these steroids are given, because they can accumulate inside the cell, and it can have some negative side effects that we'll talk about later. So the effects can be long-lasting. All right. Okay, so what have we spoken about before? We've spoken about kind of the classes of hormones. Some we spoke about amines, peptides and proteins, and steroids. And I've already mentioned that some can be hydrophilic, the ones that bind to the cell membrane receptors. Some can be hydrophobic, or we can, as I would say, lipophilic, and they bind to intracellular receptors. So that's the target cell. That's one end. But what about the release of these hormones? What about the cell that they originate from as opposed to the cell that they're going to affect? With hydrophilic messengers, so that would be like norepinephrine, epinephrine, right? Growth hormone, prolactin, stuff like that. They're released from a cell and dissolve in the blood. Very easy. They're hydrophilic. Blood is a water-based liquid. Plasma is a water-based, so these hormones dissolve in the liquid very well, and they travel through the blood to the target cell. In contrast, steroids, or you can even say some of the other lipophilic molecules, once they enter into the blood, they're not going to go very far by themselves. If you think of oil and water don't mix very well, that would be the same thing with these. They're lipophilic or hydrophobic. They don't dissolve in the blood. So in order to get from site A to site B, they need to be carried there by carrier proteins. And so there's carrier proteins for thyroid hormones, carrier proteins for steroid hormones, things like that. All right, moving along here. Let's take a look now. So that's kind of a lot of the preliminary stuff, although it seemed like somewhat long-winded. A lot of the preliminary stuff to give you a little background on the endocrine system before we actually dive into the specific organs. I always like to start off with the pituitary and the hypothalamus, because this is where we have a lot of hormones that control organs and other areas of the body. And you can see how they're connected. The hypothalamus is, of course, located at the base of the brain, and it's connected by this stalk called the infundibulum to the pituitary, right? This is an actual pituitary and hypothalamus. Now, without getting into too much detail, I did want to point out a couple things. The pituitary is divided up into two portions. One is called the anterior lobe, and one is called the posterior lobe. And we're going to find that different groups of hormones are found in each. Okay. Let's first talk about the posterior pituitary. So here's the hypothalamus. Here's the anterior pituitary. Here's the posterior pituitary. Here's that infundibulum. First thing I want to point out are these long structures that start off in the hypothalamus and travel into the posterior pituitary. These are neurosecretory cells, or just really long neurons, that are responsible for producing two hormones, oxytocin and vasopressin. Oxytocin and vasopressin, right? The region of the hypothalamus are known as the paraventricular nucleus and the supraoptic nucleus. Those two regions of the hypothalamus contain clusters of these neurosecretory cells that produce those hormones, but the hormones, once they're made, travel all the way down to the end of the neuron where they're stored in this terminal in the posterior pituitary. They're stored there until the demand, remember I mentioned in order for a hormone to be secreted, there has to be a trigger. And once the trigger comes into play, the hormones are released into the blood. And just like a hormone, right, they travel to their target organ. So those two hormones, oxytocin and vasopressin, are produced in the hypothalamus, but they're stored in the posterior pituitary. All right. So here's just another view of it right here. Paraventricular nucleus, supraoptic nucleus. They're made up here and they travel a long ways and they're stored until they need to be released. All right, so what do the hormones do, right? Because that's one of the functions. We need to know the gland, the hormone, and the target organ, right? And what they do, okay? So let's first take a look at oxytocin. The effects of this hormone, even though both males and females produce it, the effects of oxytocin were first determined in females. And one of the first things that was known is that this hormone is responsible for triggering contraction of the uterus during the onset of labor at the end of pregnancy. Those contractions. And that's why a woman who's late to term, doctors will often give them a synthetic version of this hormone called Pitocin. And that will trigger contractions to induce labor. Also in females, oxytocin is responsible for milk letdown. Now, letdown, that doesn't mean sort of a psychological disappointment. In this case, letdown means the release of milk to the infant from the mammary glands, right? So the mammary glands are making milk. In order for the infant to get it, there's these specialized muscle cells inside the mammary gland that contract, and they will squeeze the milk so that the baby can nurse. Also in females, maternal behavior, kind of the nurturing, bonding, that seems to be related to oxytocin. What about in males? Now, there are some questions exactly, but there are certain things that are very clear. I want you to just, we can cross off or ignore the stimulates testosterone to DHT. Don't worry about that because we haven't really had time to discuss that. What I do want you to know is that it appears to play a role in erection and ejaculation. Involves muscle contraction of these regions of the male reproductive tract that help to move sperm and semen along. So in a sense, it's similar to the female in the sense that it stimulates muscle contraction, smooth muscle contraction. Vasopressin, right? So this is not anything new. We've been down this road before. We know vasopressin, otherwise known as ADH, is produced in response to low blood volume, or blood loss, and this promotes fluid retention or water retention. Remember, we spoke about those aquaporins, right, that allow for water to be transported from the kidneys into the kidney cell, into the blood. So that's the role of vasopressin. We're not going to worry about aldosterone now, although you already know what aldosterone does, right? Increases sodium reabsorption. All right, I think we've seen a slide like this before, but since we're talking about this again, we'll just revisit it. This is a picture showing a kidney cell, kind of showing the mechanism of action of vasopressin. AVP stands for arginine vasopressin. I'm not going to have you know that first part. Just know vasopressin binds to its receptor on the cell membrane and triggers the movement of these aquaporins, remember, to be inserted into the apical membrane, which allows water to move from the kidney from the kidney lumen into the kidney cell. And then these aquaporin 3s, which are always there, can carry that water or to allow for that water to move right into the blood. So this is really revisiting something you already know. All right. We're going to finish today with the anterior pituitary. And whereas both pituitaries, obviously, both branches of the pituitary, both lobes are very important, they're a little bit different in function, right? Interestingly, the posterior pituitary is derived from brain tissue. So it's neurological and embryological origins. Whereas the anterior pituitary is epithelial in origin. All right. So let's take a look at the anterior pituitary and some of the differences. Well, what are some of the similarities? Well, first of all, we do see, for example, neurons in the hypothalamus. We saw those before going in the posterior pituitary. But here you notice these neurons are shorter, and they're interacting with these blood vessels, these capillary beds up here. So what's going on? These neurosecretory cells are producing what we call releasing, mostly releasing, but in some cases inhibiting hormones. So what does that mean? Well, let's just stick with releasing hormones. The hormones released from these neurosecretory cells travel into these capillary beds that are going to carry them into the anterior pituitary. Once those releasing hormones enter into the anterior pituitary, they trigger the release of another set of hormones in the pituitary because we have a separate set of endocrine cells. So it's kind of like a relay system. These cells release these hormones travel all the way down to trigger the release of anterior pituitary hormones. Now, these are what we call releasing hormones from the hypothalamus. There are also what we call inhibiting hormones. There are some hormones that inhibit the production of pituitary hormones. All right. Now, I do want to, so hopefully you guys see that. This type of system we've got right here, this vasculature, I want to spend a little bit of time on it. This is a very unique vasculature, right? Normally we think of arteries or arterioles entering into capillaries, and then capillaries into venules and veins. But in this case, we've got one set of capillary and a second set of capillary. This is what we call a portal system. And this allows for a much more efficient delivery of these releasing and inhibiting hormones directly to the anterior pituitary, which allow, as opposed to them being diluted in the general circulation. So it allows it to be delivered more efficiently. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. All right, so what hormones are produced in the anterior pituitary? Quite a few. Now, just to go back just a second, remember that the hormones in the posterior pituitary are not made there. They're made in the hypothalamus, and they're stored in the posterior pituitary. On the anterior side, the anterior pituitary hormones are made in the anterior pituitary. Their release is either triggered or inhibited by hypothalamic hormones. So if we take a look at this picture, going across this middle section. So if we take a look here across going from side to side, here we've got the hypothalamus. Here's the anterior pituitary, and these are the target organs. Let's first start with the hormones produced by the anterior pituitary. We have prolactin, which you've already heard of. And I'm just going to focus its role on females because in males, the effects are a little bit newer, although they appear to affect the prostate. But right now, we're just going to stick with its very well-known role of stimulating the production of milk in mammals. Another hormone is TSH, which stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. And with a name like that, you know it goes right to the thyroid gland to stimulate the thyroid gland to make its own thyroid hormones. We'll learn more about thyroid hormones tomorrow. We have another hormone called ACTH, which stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone. I'll spell that out for you shortly. With a name like that, it travels to the adrenal cortex, stimulates the release of cortisol, which we'll learn more about next time. Let me just go back and spell out ACTH for you. All right, so ACTH equals so that's what it's. So that's what it stands for. ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. Next, we have growth hormone. Not the most exciting name, but the name kind of indicates what its role is. It's involved in growth, metabolism, things like that. It targets most organs in the body, and we'll learn a bit more about how it affects growth and development. But separately from that, it also targets the liver, where it stimulates the production of another hormone called insulin-like growth factors. Now, you guys have heard about IGF when we were talking about muscle hypertrophy, right? Well, that's one effect of insulin-like growth factor, which is produced in muscle, but we have IGF, which is produced by the liver, which has other effects as well. So, finally, we have another set of cells that produce LH and FSH. These are known as the gonadotropins. These affect the gonads, both male and female, and you can see the corresponding hormones they stimulate, as well as organ growth and development. During puberty, during pregnancy in females, menopause, different changes that occur in males and females. The hormones are called LH and FSH. Let me go back and spell that for you, although some of you guys probably already know that. So LH equals luteinizing hormone, and FSH equals follicle stimulating hormone. Now, the names of those, it's kind of deceptive because both of these names indicate more of what they're doing in females with the ovaries, but that's because they were first discovered in females. But of course, both males and females do produce those hormones. All right. Let me go new share. Oops, that didn't work out very well. There we go. All right. So what about the hypothalamus, right? So here you can see the hypothalamus, which is really kind of the top of the hierarchy. That's where you have the hormones that either stimulate or inhibit the pituitary hormones. So I'm not going to spell all of these out for you. You can probably see this in the book or look at it online, but we have what's called prolactin releasing hormone, prolactin inhibiting hormone, both from the hypothalamus. We have TRH, TSH releasing hormone. We have CRH, corticotropic releasing hormone. We have two hormones in the hypothalamus that one can stimulate growth hormone, one can inhibit it. And then we have what's called GnRH, which stimulates the production of LH and FSH. What's interesting about this, especially with these inhibiting hormones, these have been important clinically in some cases for people who have pituitary tumors. And the most common type of pituitary tumor is where someone's making too much growth hormone or too much prolactin. So doctors will sometimes administer this growth hormone inhibiting hormone to slow down the growth of this growth hormone producing tumor. If someone's producing too much prolactin, they sometimes can give them PIH, which is actually dopamine can actually inhibit prolactin, and that will inhibit it. That's amongst some of the other types of treatments. All right. So to kind of summarize a bit, and tomorrow we'll get into more about this, let's take a look at the pituitary hormone. So TSH stimulates the thyroid gland to make T3 and T4. General function is metabolism and growth. We'll talk more about the specifics tomorrow. ACTH goes to the adrenal gland, adrenal cortex, stimulates cortisol. Now, these other hormones are some of the ones that are produced in other animals, but let's just focus on cortisol. That's involved in the stress response as well as some aspects of metabolism. Growth hormone targets a lot of different organs. Liver is a good example, as well as muscle and fat, more growth and metabolic actions, similar in some cases to thyroid hormone. Prolactin, milk production in mammals, but in various vertebrates, as we already learned, they're involved in osmoregulation, maternal behavior, as well as, like I mentioned, in birds, right? The crop sac, as well as the brood patch. Another one is MSH, and I mentioned this plays a role in pigmentation, skin darkening, primarily in amphibians, reptiles. It says except birds. There are some examples that are known of some birds that are affected by MSH, but with amphibians and reptiles, and in fact some fish, it appears to be much more prominent as a more of like a camouflage type of a thing, or even like a display behavior. Finally, we've got the gonadotropins, which target both the gonads in males and females. Like the previous slide showed, it's important in stimulating hormone production in the gonads, but it also does affect growth and gamete production. So for example, growth and development of the ovaries and the testes, right? But also it does stimulate egg development and sperm production. So anything related to reproduction. All right. So this is a slide, probably should have had a little bit earlier, but I just wanted to expand a little bit on this portal system in the pituitary, how it's very significant it is. So these two sets of capillary beds, which connect the hypothalamus with the anterior pituitary, are called the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. Hypophyseal or hypophysis was the old name for the pituitary gland. The importance of this complex, this dual capillary bed, is to allow the concentration of small amounts of those hypothalamic hormones, the releasing and the inhibiting hormones, to divert them or to direct them to go right to the target cells in the pituitary, and thus they're not diluted in the general circulation. This allows for a much more efficient control of the pituitary gland. All right. A couple questions here. Hold on. Are LH and FSH specific to males and females, respectively? Okay. Jeffries, yeah, I see you're here. Well, LH and FSH are produced in both. So females produce LH and FSH, and males produce LH and FSH. Alejandra, looks like we got three. Let's see. Alejandra, on slide 28, you mentioned the posterior was embryonic. Ooh, I didn't say it. Okay. It's derived, okay, it's embryonic. It's derived from neural tissue. So the posterior pituitary is derived from neural tissue embryologically. The anterior pituitary is derived more from epithelial tissue. And in fact, if I were to show you a picture, it's interesting. Tissues migrate from the roof of the mouth and migrate upward, and they make contact with the neural outgrowth of the posterior pituitary. So that's the difference. So posterior pituitary is embryological origin is neural, and with the anterior, it's epithelial. It says that there are like 3 questions. All I see is 2. Why is that? Let's see. Okay, all right. If there's no other questions. So like I said, so tomorrow we're going to cover the second part of the endocrine system. And I know a couple of you may have shown up for office hours, and you know there's only been 1 or 2, so I haven't really schedule them on a regular basis. Tomorrow I will definitely be here. Tomorrow I will have office hours because I'm sure a couple of you guys are interested. I'm sure. Tomorrow I will be here for sure. What's tomorrow? Thursday. Tomorrow I will be here at 10 o'clock. So I will go ahead and email. Well, actually, it's on the video. So anyway. So looks like that's it. So Zach, Alejandra, Jeffrey, and captioner Gloria. I will see you guys tomorrow.